You may be seated. Our scripture reading is, again, it's found in your bulletin if you'd like to follow along. Moses answered, "What if they do not believe me or listen to me and say, 'The Lord did not appear to you'?" Then the Lord said to him, "What is that in your hand?" "A staff," he replied. The Lord said, "Throw it on the ground." Moses threw it on the ground, and it became a snake, and he ran from it. Then the Lord said to him, "Reach out your hand, take it by the tail." So Moses reached out, and he took a hold of the snake, and it turned back into a staff in his hand. "This," said the Lord, "is so that they may believe that the Lord, the God of their fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, has appeared to you." Moses said to the Lord, "Pardon your servant. I have never been eloquent, neither in the past nor since you have spoken to your servant. I am slow of speech and tongue." The Lord said to him, "Who gave human beings their mouths? Who makes them deaf or mute? Who gives them sight or makes them blind? Is it not I, the Lord? Now go, and I will help you speak and will teach you what to say." Moses said, "Pardon your servant, Lord, please. Send someone else." Then the Lord's anger burned against Moses, and he said, "What about your brother, Aaron the Levite? I know he can speak well. He is already on his way to meet you, and he will be glad to see you. You shall speak to him and put words in his mouth, and I will help both of you speak and will teach you what to do. But take this staff in your hand, that you can perform the signs with it." This morning, before we begin our message, we have a video that we want to show you real quickly.
Honey, did you call the insurance company?
Not yet. I'm folding the laundry. Can you?
No, cleaning the windows.
Well, the living room's a disaster.
You should see the bathroom.
Most insurance companies give you every reason to avoid them.
I'm looking for my keys.
Plants need planting.
Well, the leaves aren't going to rake themselves.
Nationwide is different.
Hon, did you call Nationwide to check on our claim?
We put members first.
Actually, they called me.
Nationwide is on your side.
You know, we said we'd take a look at our retirement plan today.
Not now. Cleaning the oven.
Yeah, I'm cleaning the gutters.
Washing the dog.
Washing the cat.
Well, I'm learning Snapchat. Chat.
Changing the oil.
It's surprising what people would rather do than deal with retirement.
Pressure washing that roses.
Aerating the lawn.
But with Nationwide, it's no big deal.
Okay, your retirement plan is all set.
Nationwide. Awesome.
Nice neighborhood.
Nationwide is on your side.
How many of you have seen those ads numerous times, right? How many of you resemble, maybe not for buying insurance, but how many of you resemble those ads? And haven't we all at one time or another used "the dog has ate my homework" excuse or something like that? Well, this morning, what I want to look at is the 5 excuses that Moses gave for not wanting to do what God was asking him to do. And those 5 excuses are found first in chapter 3, which we've looked at 2 of those excuses already, and then they go all the way through chapter 4, verse 17. But before we look at what the excuses are, we need to review real quickly what it was that God was asking Moses to do. And that Moses, as you recall, he's a shepherd for his father-in-law Jethro. And he's out by Mount Horeb, which we would know as Mount Sinai, and he has this encounter with God in the burning bush. And what God tells him to do is he says, "I want you to go back to Egypt." Now, Moses hasn't lived in Egypt for 40 years. So he says, "I want you to go back to Egypt, and then when you're in Egypt, I want you first to meet with the elders of the leaders. And with the elders, you're supposed to tell them that I have appeared to you, that you have met the God of their ancestors, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And then you are to tell them that we are going to go to Pharaoh, not just Moses, but the elders are going to approach Pharaoh, and they're going to say, we need to make a 3-day journey into the wilderness so that we might sacrifice to our God, because I'm going to bring you," and using Moses, "I'm going to use you to bring Israel up out of their bondage in Egypt, because I am aware of their suffering. and we're going to take them up into the promised land, the land of the Hivites, the Canaanites, the Perizzites, and all the other ites that live up there. And so that's what Moses was supposed to do, and it's actually pretty straightforward what God is telling him to do. And so the question is if God has spoken to Moses out of a burning bush, why doesn't Moses want to go? Why wouldn't he do this? And there are several reasons why Moses might not want to have done this. Four of the reasons that I can think of is maybe the first reason is that Moses is content. He has been living in Midian now for 40 years. He has a wife, he has 2 sons, and one of the suspicions is that Moses' life, it's going okay. It's not maybe what he was expecting it to be when he was a prince of Egypt, but nonetheless, he's content. Now, we have a problem with that because most of us are not content in our life, and being content is actually a virtue. But an awful lot of us, we live our life in I'll be happy when mode, and I've told you this before, and so you've heard it, but I'll be happy when I graduate. I'll be happy when I get married. I'll be happy when I have kids. I'll be happy when I get a better job. I'll be happy when the kids graduate. I'll be happy when I retire. I'll be happy when I... And on and on and on. We're always looking for the next I'll be happy wins. Moses evidently isn't doing that. He's happy. He's content. And so why in the world would he want to go back to Egypt and mess with his contentment? The second reason why Moses may not have wanted to go is he's just simply afraid. The first thing that God says to him is, go back to Egypt. That's probably the last thing that Moses wants to do. When Moses was in Egypt, bad things were happening to him. Now, he was the prince of Egypt. But my suspicion is that because Moses was the adopted son of Pharaoh's daughter, they never let Moses forget that he was adopted. They never let Moses forget that he's not actually Egyptian, that he's a Hebrew. I suspect that although Moses lived in prosperity, that he didn't have very many friends, that he was somewhat ostracized all the time. And so he wasn't accepted by the Egyptians, and he wasn't accepted by the Hebrews, and plus he had a murder rap on him, that he had killed an Egyptian taskmaster. And so I think Moses was afraid to go back. I think there is also the fear of failure. God says, go back to Egypt, and I think all Moses is thinking, well, the last time that I tried to help my people, there were 2 slaves who were fighting each other, and I said to them, brothers, why are you fighting each other? And I was rebuked. My trying to help failed. They said, who made you master and ruler over us? Are you going to kill me like you killed the Egyptian taskmaster? And so I think part of it for Moses is that why would it be any different now? In fact, I've been gone for 40 years. Who's even going to remember me? If I try and go back now, they'll just laugh at me. And so why bother? And perhaps the fourth reason why he might not have wanted to go back is because of shame and embarrassment. When Moses lived in Egypt, he lived in wealth and prosperity. He lived in comfort. His kinspeople, the Hebrews, were in bondage and being oppressed. Moses had luxury. They had pain and torture. Moses didn't do anything about it. And then when he did try to help, it didn't work. And so now when he's in Midian, I think Moses is embarrassed by the fact that he just really doesn't care about his kinsmen anymore. Out of sight, out of mind. And so now when God says go back to Egypt, it's embarrassing. I feel sorry for them, but I really don't, this isn't my issue anymore. I don't care. So he's embarrassed by that. Now, I don't know if any of these are the reasons why Moses not want to go back, or whether all of them or part of them or whatever. But for whatever the reason, Moses doesn't want to go. It's like the Nationwide insurance commercial. He didn't want to do this, and so he's going to wash the cat and learn Snapchat and all these various other things, clean the oven, anything other than what God is asking him to do. And that's you and I. We make all kinds of excuses as to why we don't need to do what God wants us to do. Each and every one of us is called to be in ministry. That's not just me who's called into ministry. It's not just Shelley. It's not just Tyler. All of us, each and every one of us is called to be in ministry. Each and every one of us has a sphere of influence that we are responsible for. Our family members, our friends, our coworkers, our teammates, our classmates, our neighbors who live across the street or next door to us. All of these people are part of our sphere of influence, and at the very least, we are responsible to pray for them, to care for them, to watch out for them, to ask God's blessings to be upon them, to witness to them, at least in our actions, if not by our words on occasion. And to be honest, we don't want to do that. We want, for whatever reason, whether it's embarrassment because we haven't done it or because we're afraid that, or whatever, we don't want to be in ministry because ministry is messy. It messes up with our contentment. It messes up with our time. It just messes with us. And so we don't want to get involved. Now, how many of you are feeling guilty? A quick aside here is that when I preach messages like this, you only get convicted once. I've been convicted 7 days now, working on this thing. And all of these excuses that Moses gives are the same ones that we give, plus more. Plus more. The first excuse that Moses gave is the one that we've looked at already, where when God says, I want you to go back, Moses' first response was, well, who am I to go back to Pharaoh? The who am I? And so the first excuse that we will often use as to why we cannot get involved in ministry or why we can't reach out to our neighbors and our friends and our coworkers is that we think that I'm not qualified. And that was Moses. He was thinking that he was ignorant of himself. He didn't know who he was, but also he had self-doubts. And he was thinking, who am I that I could go back to Pharaoh? And I'm sure everything that he was thinking is I can't go back to Pharaoh because I'm a fugitive. I got all this past baggage, all this stuff. I can't go back to Pharaoh because I'm no longer Prince of Egypt. I have no standing in the court. There's, all of these various excuses that he would be able to give as to why he is disqualified or unqualified to go back to Pharaoh and to do what God was asking him to do. I'm a criminal. I'm a fugitive. I'm not trained in this anymore. And isn't that what we do? Why can't I do something? Well, never been to seminary, haven't got a college degree, don't know what to say, don't know how to say it. Why am I qualified to do that? How can I pray for somebody when I barely pray for myself? How can I share with somebody when I don't know what I would say? How can I do this because I've been divorced, or I've been in prison, or my life's been a mess, or I've got all of this baggage in my life? And we have all of these reasons why we can say that I am not qualified, that I can't do it. But the interesting answer that God gives to Moses is he says, I will be with you. Moses is thinking it's all on me. I've got to do it. You're saying I got to go back to Egypt, that it's all on me. He completely misses the point. It's not on him. It's on God. And God's just going to use him. And that's what God says to us, is I will be with you. So that when we minister to our friends and to our neighbors and our classmates, God is working through us in order that we might be able to do what God is asking us to do. So then, Moses changes the question. Since God has resolved the who am I, the question then becomes, who are you? And so Moses says to God, okay, who are you? But the real issue is that not only does Moses not know Moses doesn't know God. But the issue here then is that it's a dodge. His real issue is he throws out these hypothetical questions of everything that could go wrong. And so he says, suppose, I'm not saying that I'm actually going to go back to Egypt, but just suppose for the sake of argument that I go. If I go back to Egypt, the people are going to say, what is God's name? And if I don't know the password, what your name is, then they're not going to pay attention to me, and I'm going to fail. And so it's all of these hypothetical questions as to what could go wrong. Don't we do that? When we know that God is calling us or asking us to do something, to share with our neighbors, to be in prayer for them, to be concerned about them, don't we start thinking of all the hypothetical reasons as to why we shouldn't do it because what could go wrong? And so we have our whole little formula just like Moses does. Well, if I do, fill in the blank, what God's asking us to do, then blank might happen. And all we can think of is all the bad things that might happen. They might get mad at us. They might get embarrassed. We might get embarrassed. We might say the wrong thing. And so then, since I don't know or have the right training, the right words, the right education, the right insights, I'll fail. And if I'm going to fail, why bother? Why should I go and make a fool out of myself or hurt myself? And so we make all of those excuses as to why we can't do it. Well, the interesting thing, again, is in God's response. And that Moses, I don't think, actually thought God was going to give him his name. But God does. He says, I am, I am. I am little, I am, capital letters, which means Yahweh. And he's not so much given him a name, but he's given him a theology. And that the I am is I am who you need me to be. I am the I am who will be with you always. I am the I am who is with you in the past, who is with you now, and will be with you in the future. I am the I am who is aware of Israel's suffering and their bondage, and I have not forgotten them, and I'm going to remember my covenant with Abraham. I'm the same God who remembers that you killed the Egyptian, that you've been wandering around in Midian, and that you don't think you are what you're supposed to be. I have always been with you, I will always be with you, and I will always be with you in the future. That's an amen. And that's what God is telling us when he gives him his name. And God gives us his name as well. He is our Father, who art in heaven. And he is with us always. He's always been with us. He's with us now. He'll be with us in the future. But now what Moses does is that once again God instructs him and tells him what he wants him to do. And God says to Moses, the people will listen to you. And then Moses throws another hypothetical question out there when he says, but suppose. Now, did you hear that? The people will listen to you. And Moses goes, but suppose they don't. You've just had God speaking to you out of a burning bush. and Moses has the audacity to call God a liar. But suppose the people won't listen to me. How many of you would have enough nerve to call God a liar? Moses has got some boldness to him. So he says to God, I don't believe you. He doubts God. He doubts what God is telling him. That's probably our number one excuse. Now, we don't want to admit that, but isn't it true? We know when God's asking us to do something, calling us to do something, and we doubt him. We reject it. We say, no, I don't know. It's like, well, I know that the pastor says, that God is calling all of us to be in ministry. But maybe the pastor really doesn't know everything that he thinks he does. Maybe he doesn't really know me. Maybe he really doesn't know the scriptures like he thinks he does. He really can't be talking about me. And so we make all of these excuses, and we doubt that God is telling us what we're supposed to do. Well, God's response to Moses in this one is actually pretty elaborate. In that he says to Moses, what's in your hand? Well, Moses, of course, is holding his shepherd's staff. That's his identity now. He's been a shepherd for 40 years. This is his main tool. If you ask Moses, who are you? He'd show us, I'm a shepherd. That's what I am. That's what I do now. That's my identity. And so God says to throw that shepherd's staff, his very identity, who he is, to throw it on the ground. So Moses does. And it turns into a snake. And he jumps back because he's frightened. Well, the snake has all kinds of symbolism here in that the serpent, that was the shape that Satan took in the Garden of Eden when he was tempting Adam and Eve. But also the Pharaoh's symbol was a cobra. And the headdress that the Pharaoh wore is to resemble the hood of a cobra. That's why they wore that funny thing. And why when you look at the Sphinx, he's got the big headdress around it. That's the symbol of the Pharaoh. It's the symbol of the cobra. And so Moses throws this thing down, and the worst thing that a staff could turn into would be a snake, the demon, the Pharaoh, all these things that he's afraid of. But notice in what God tells him to do. He tells him to grab the snake, but did you hear where he's supposed to grab the snake by? The tail. Now, if you're going to grab a snake, which I don't highly recommend, but if you're going to grab a snake, where do you grab it? Right behind the head. Because if you grab it by the tail, what's it do? It spins around and it'll bite you. Do you realize how much faith it takes for Moses to, to reach for the tail of the snake, let alone being a snake, but to have to reach for the tail? There's a lesson there. And that God is testing Moses' faith. He says, you doubt me that you can go back to Egypt, reach for the tail of the snake. But Moses does, and he grabs the tail of the snake, and what's it turn into again? It turns back to a staff. And then God says to Moses, put your hand in the fold of your robe. So he puts his hand in the fold of his robe, and he takes it out, and his hand turns leprous. Now, we miss how much faith it takes for Moses when God says, put your hand back in the fold of your robe. Leprosy was considered to be extremely contagious. Moses is thinking, if I put my leprous hand into my robe, then my whole body's going to become leprous. But Moses has the faith to do this. So he puts his hand in his robe and he takes it out, and his hand is clean. And he says, with these two signs, if you will do these two signs, if you will obey me, the people who you think will not listen to you, this will give you authority. And they will listen to you. They'll pay attention. Well, the distinction I want to make here is between signs and wonders. The two are the same thing, but for the sake of argument, I want to differentiate them out. Signs are what God gives to believers, to Christians, in order for us to believe. It's an assurance of our faith. Wonders, which can be the exact same event as the sign was, are for non-believers. And what they do is they convince and they convict. They convince and they convict. So God gives Moses a sign that I am with you, which is to be a wonder to the Hebrew people and to Pharaoh, that is to convict them that God is with them. When I was serving one of my congregations, there was a fellow by the name of Daryl. Daryl was my age at the time, and so he was in his early 40s, late 30s. Actually, he was younger than I was. And he occasionally would have a heart issue where his heart would start to beat too fast and be irregular. Most of the time, they were able to treat it with medication, but sometimes they would have to shock him, zap him. He never looked forward to when that was happening. He and his family started to come to church. Daryl would very rarely come. When he would come, it was mainly just to please his wife, so he would show up for the holidays or whatever. And so his heart went into AFib again. And so he was in the hospital, and his wife told me that he was in the hospital, and so I went to visit him, and when I heard the story, what was going on, the medication was not working, and they were scheduled to shock him in a couple of hours. And so I told Daryl, I said, I feel God's calling me to pray for you that your heart's not going to, that you're not going to need shocked. He's looking at me like, that I'm retarded. And I said, well, I'm going to pray for you. And he's got nothing to lose at this point, so he says, okay. And so I put my hand over his heart, and I just simply prayed a short prayer saying, Lord, I want you to take his heart out of defib, and this wouldn't happen again. And then I said goodbye, and I left. 20, 30 minutes later, his heart rhythm returned to normal, without medication, without shocking. But the whole time that we lived in that community, it never went back into AFib or defib again. That was a sign for me, because I could have wimped out. I could have not gone to the hospital when I was called, or I could have not prayed for him, or I could have done one of those real generic prayers, Dear Lord, heal Daryl, But I felt very specifically that God was telling me to pray that his heart would go back into rhythm. So I acted out of faith, and it did. For Daryl, this caused him all kinds of issues, because he had to wrestle with two questions now. First, what did you do? And then secondly, was that God? That God working in my life? So he was having to wrestle with conviction and being convinced that God really cared about him and wanted to be involved with his family. Signs and wonders. And I think God gives us signs and wonders today. Pray for our neighbors, be involved with our classmates and our workmates, to get involved in their lives, to just inquire as to what's happening in their life, and to show that care and concern. And that God will then lead you as to what to do for them, so that they might be convinced and convicted that God is in their life. So now what Moses does is he mouths off. There's a pun there. Because what he says to God now is he says that I am not eloquent. I have never been a good speaker. I have some sort, I am slow of tongue and slow of lips, or heavy of tongues, heavy in lips. And so Moses says that he can't do it because he's got this issue. Now, scholars say that there's probably 4 different things here that what Moses means by saying that he's not eloquent and he's slow of speech and tongue. Could be a speech impediment. Maybe Moses stutters, doesn't speak plainly. The second one is that Moses is saying that I don't remember the Hebrew or the Egyptian language anymore. It's been 40 years since I've lived there, and so I'm no longer adequate to be able to speak to them in their tongue. He could be saying that he's just not a good public speaker, that he can't think fast enough on his feet. So how can he go to Pharaoh and to the world's leaders and actually, be quick enough on his feet to argue with them and to talk about them? Or maybe it's just a plain excuse. Now, the interesting thing here is that if Moses has some sort of a problem with communication, he doesn't have any problem talking back to God. And this is the 4th time that he has told God, that he's not interested in doing this. But most scholars think that what Moses actually has is a speech impediment. The Hebrew grammar seems to lean towards the idea that Moses actually has some sort of a physical limitation. Probably does stutter or has some sort of a malformed tongue or whatever, that he isn't able, he's just not a good physical communicator. Now, where this differs from the first excuse is the first excuse is imaginary shortcomings. This one, that's actually a physical issue. Moses really does have a disability here. But that's no excuse for Moses, and it's no excuse for God. God doesn't show Moses much sympathy in this. He says, well, who gives sight? Who gives hearing? I do. I also am the one who gives speech. And so what he's basically saying is that I made you this way. You realize that? God's saying to Moses, I made you this way. And nowhere does God ever heal Moses of his speech problem. He's simply saying that I can use your imperfections in order to bring about my will. Each and every one of us is given gifts and abilities. We're aware of those, right? But also each and every one of us is broken. Each and every one of us has our shortcomings and our flaws, things that we don't do well. God can use our gifts and our abilities, and He can also use our imperfections and our flaws to bring about what He wants to do. In fact, it was through Moses' being an imperfect communicator, he becomes an instrument that God is able to use. Now, that should be a little bit humbling for us. When we start making excuses, well, I can't do something because I haven't had the education, or I have been divorced, or I've been in jail, or those are the very imperfections and weaknesses God uses to show his glory. So then Moses, finally, he's had enough. He's frustrated. And so he basically says to God, I don't want to go. What part of this haven't you figured out yet? I don't want to go. Send someone else. Here I am. Send someone else. And God gets mad. And this is the first time where we find that God's anger is directed towards an individual. He's been angry at the entire world when he redoes it with Noah. But this is the first time where we read that God gets angry at an individual. And God gets mad at Moses. And he basically says to Moses, so sad, too bad. You're going. Moses really doesn't have a choice in this thing because Moses is the right guy for the right time. And so the concession that he gives is, your brother Aaron, he can talk. I'm sending him out. In fact, I've already called him. He's on his way. You're going to have the elders of Israel that you're supposed to be working with. You keep thinking this is all about you. It's not about you. It's about my remembering my people and the covenant with them. And so pick up your staff and just go and do it. And when he tells him to pick up his staff, he gave it back to him. It was a snake, and he gives him back the staff of being a shepherd. But now he's not going to be a shepherd of sheep and goats. He's going to be the shepherd of God's people. And all of his past, all of his present, everything that makes up who Moses is all going to come into play for his being the deliverer and the lawgiver of Israel. And God does the same thing with us. He takes our past, he takes our presence, he takes our gifts and our abilities, he takes our weaknesses and our shortcomings. He takes all of those things, and it's what makes us who we are so that we can be in ministry to our neighbors and our friends and our classmates. Those things, that's what makes you who you are. And that's what God wants to use. Now, none of us is being called to deliver an entire nation. At least I don't think so. Maybe some of you will be. But we are called for our sphere of ministry to be involved. And there have been times in my life when I have neglected or rejected what God has asked me to do. For whatever reason, I gave my excuses. For Moses, God refused to take no for an answer. I find that in my life that there have been times when God has accepted my no. It doesn't happen with me. Two things happen, I find, when I reject when God's given me a ministry opportunity. One of the things that will happen is that I'll say, send somebody else, and God will. He'll send somebody else, and I will be able to see the blessing that they received and the persons that they were ministering with were receiving. And I miss out. And I see that. The second thing that sometimes happens is that the next time there's an opportunity, I realize that I've been set aside, that I have not been asked to be a part of this ministry because God is using somebody else. So again, I'm sorry, but did I just miss something? Yes, I did. I missed out. What about us? What about you? What are your excuses? Are you going to keep using excuses? Or when God says, go to Egypt, are you going to say,